The sand-laden wind swept across the main street of Promise Creek as Willow Blackburn stepped off the stagecoach, her pale blue dress billowing around her ankles. The year was 1876, a time when the West was still wild and untamed, much like the heart that beat furiously beneath her corset. She had come to this dusty corner of Arizona territory with a singular purpose: to marry a man she'd never met, a promise made by her father before his death to settle an old debt. But destiny had other plans for her, beginning with the man who now stood before her, hand extended to help her down the final step, a rugged cowboy with eyes the color of a storm-swept sky. Willow accepted the stranger's calloused hand, feeling a peculiar spark as their fingers touched. His hat cast a shadow over his face, but she could still make out the strong line of his jaw, the 3-day stubble that framed a mouth more accustomed to commanding than conversing. "Welcome to Promise Creek, madam," he said, his voice as rough as the landscape surrounding them. "You must be the new schoolteacher." "No," she replied, suddenly aware of how out of place she must look with her city clothes and polished manners. "I'm Willow Blackburn. I've come to marry Mr. Harold Whitfield." Something flickered across the cowboy's face, surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. He released her hand and took a step back. "Whitfield, the banker." "Yes, it was arranged some time ago." She hesitated, wondering why she felt compelled to explain herself to this stranger. "I was promised to him by my father." The cowboy's expression darkened as he removed his hat, revealing hair the color of wheat fields in late summer. "Name's Ross Brannigan, Miss Blackburn. I own the Triple R ranch just north of town." He studied her face for a moment before continuing. "Promises are funny things out here. Some are worth keeping, others—" He trailed off, replacing his hat. "Others need breaking." With those cryptic words, he tipped his hat and turned away, leaving Willow to wonder what she had gotten herself into in this town that shared a name with something she'd already begun to doubt: a promise. The local hotel, the only one in Promise Creek, was a 2-story wooden structure that had seen better days. The proprietress, a widow named Martha Holloway, showed Willow to a small but clean room on the second floor. "Mr. Whitfield arranged for your stay until the wedding," Martha explained as she opened the shutters to let in the afternoon light. "Said to make sure you were comfortable." "That's very kind of him," Willow replied, though she couldn't help but wonder why her future husband hadn't come to greet her himself. "He's a busy man, dear," Martha said, as if reading her thoughts. "Runs the bank, owns half the businesses in town." Not much happens in Promise Creek without Harold Whitfield knowing about it. "And what of Mr. Brannigan?" The question escaped Willow's lips before she could stop it. Martha's eyebrows rose slightly. "Ross, you've met him already, have you?" She busied herself with straightening the bedspread. "He keeps to himself mostly, except when he comes to town for supplies or to have a drink at the saloon. Good man, though. Fair to his hands, doesn't cause trouble." She paused. "Had his share of hardship, too. Lost his wife and child to fever 5 years back. Some say that's why he works from sunup to sundown, to keep from thinking about what he's lost." Willow's heart tightened at this revelation. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Life out here isn't easy, Miss Blackburn," Martha said, her tone softening. "But it has its rewards for those who are strong enough to claim them." With that, she left Willow alone with her thoughts and the distant sound of Promise Creek going about its business outside her window. That evening, a knock on her door announced the arrival of Harold Whitfield. He was older than she had expected, perhaps 50, with graying hair and a meticulously trimmed mustache. His suit was fine imported, if she had to guess, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to respect. "Miss Blackburn," he greeted her with a slight bow. "I trust your journey was comfortable. I apologize for not meeting you at the stagecoach. Bank business, you understand." "Of course, Mr. Whitfield." The journey was long but uneventful. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Please call me Harold. After all, we are to be married in a week's time." A week. The words settled on Willow like a weight. She had known this was coming, had prepared herself for it during the long journey west, but now that the moment was upon her, she found herself struggling to breathe. "I've arranged for us to dine at my home this evening," Harold continued, oblivious to her discomfort. "I thought you might enjoy seeing where you'll be living." "That would be lovely," she managed, though the thought of food turned her stomach. Harold Whitfield's home was the grandest in Promise Creek, a two-story structure with actual glass windows and a wrap-around porch. Inside, it was furnished with pieces that must have cost a fortune to transport to this remote corner of the territory. A middle-aged woman named Mrs. Cooper served them a dinner that would have been respectable even in Boston, where Willow had grown up. Throughout the meal, Harold spoke of Promise Creek's future, the railroad that might come through, the new businesses he planned to finance, the position they would hold in society as the town grew. He spoke of we and our as if their marriage were a business arrangement, which Willow supposed it was. Her father had owed Whitfield money, and in his final days had offered his daughter's hand in lieu of payment. It was an old-fashioned arrangement, but one that would keep Willow from destitution after her father's death had left her with nothing but debts. "You're quiet this evening," Harold observed as Mrs. Cooper cleared their plates. "Forgive me. It's been a long journey, and there's much to take in." "Of course." He reached across the table to pat her hand, a gesture that was meant to be comforting but felt oddly proprietary. "You'll have time to adjust. Promise Creek may not be Boston, but it has its charms." Later, as Harold escorted her back to the hotel, they passed the town's only saloon. The sound of a piano and raucous laughter spilled out into the night, and there, tying his horse to the hitching post out front, was Ross Brannigan. Their eyes met briefly, and Willow felt that same inexplicable spark she had experienced earlier. "Brannigan," Harold acknowledged stiffly. "Whitfield," the cowboy returned, his gaze moving from the banker to Willow. "Miss Blackburn, Mr. Brannigan," she replied, aware of Harold's hand tightening on her arm. Something unspoken passed between the two men, a current of tension that Willow didn't understand but could feel as palpably as the night air on her skin. "Enjoy your evening," Ross said finally, tipping his hat before disappearing into the saloon. "I'd advise you to keep your distance from men like Brannigan," Harold said as they continued walking. "Cowboys and ranchers have their place, but it's not in polite society." Willow said nothing, but she couldn't help glancing back at the saloon, wondering what had caused the animosity between the two men, and why the mere sight of Ross Brannigan made her heart race in a way that her future husband never had. The following morning, Willow decided to explore Promise Creek in the light of day. The town was small but growing, with a main street that boasted the bank, the hotel, the saloon, a general store, and a handful of other businesses. At the far end stood a small white church, and beyond that, the schoolhouse. She was examining a display of fabrics in the general store's window when a voice behind her said, "The blue would suit you." Turning, she found herself face to face with Ross Brannigan. In daylight, she could see his eyes more clearly. They were indeed the color of a stormy sky, with flecks of gold near the pupils. "Mr. Brannigan," she acknowledged, fighting the blush that threatened to color her cheeks. "I didn't expect to see you in town again so soon." "Supply run," he explained, gesturing to his horse, laden with packages. "Ranch needs flour and coffee, and my hands get mighty ornery without their tobacco." "You have many men working for you," a dozen or so, depending on the season. Triple R isn't the biggest spread in these parts, but it's growing. He studied her for a moment. How are you finding Promise Creek, Miss Blackburn? It's different from what I'm accustomed to. Boston's a long way from here in more ways than one. She looked at him in surprise. How did you know I'm from Boston? A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. Small town. News travels fast, especially when it involves Harold Whitfield's future bride. The smile faded. Is that what you want, Miss Blackburn? To be a banker's wife in a town like this? The directness of his question caught her off guard. My father arranged the marriage before he died. It was his final wish. That's not what I asked. Their eyes met, and Willow felt as if he could see straight through to her soul. Before she could formulate a response, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. 3 riders were coming down the main street at a gallop, their manner suggesting trouble. Damn, Ross muttered, his hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip. The Dalton boys. Who? Willow asked, but Ross was already positioning himself between her and the approaching riders. The 3 men reined in their horses in front of the bank, dismounting with an air of casual menace that sent a chill down Willow's spine. They were rough-looking men, unshaven and dusty from the trail, with hard eyes that had seen too much violence. Stay here, Ross instructed her, his voice low and urgent. If there's trouble, get inside the store and stay there, you understand. Before she could answer, he was striding toward the bank, his posture alert but not aggressive. Willow watched, her heart in her throat, as Ross approached the 3 men just as they were about to enter the bank. Dalton, he called out to the tallest of the 3, a man with a scar running down the left side of his face. Didn't expect to see you boys back in these parts. The man called Dalton turned, his hand hovering near his gun. Brannigan, this ain't your concern. Anything that happens in Promise Creek is my concern, Ross replied evenly. Especially when it involves men who were run out of town for cheating at cards and stealing horses. The tension in the air was palpable as the 2 men faced off. Willow held her breath, certain she was about to witness violence. But then the door to the bank opened, and Harold Whitfield stepped out, flanked by 2 men with shotguns, bank guards, she realized. Is there a problem here, gentlemen? Harold asked, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. Dalton's eyes darted from Ross to Harold to the armed guards. After a tense moment, he spit in the dust. No problem, banker man, just passing through. Then I suggest you pass on through, Harold replied coldly. Promise Creek has no place for your kind. For a moment, Willow thought Dalton might draw his gun despite the odds against him, but then he laughed a harsh, ugly sound. Come on, boys. Ain't worth getting shot over. Not today, anyway. With that, the 3 men mounted up and rode out of town the way they had come, but not before Dalton fixed Ross with a look that promised future trouble. As the dust settled, Willow realized she had been clutching the storefront so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She watched as Harold approached Ross, the 2 men exchanging words she couldn't hear. Whatever was said, it didn't appear friendly. Harold gestured emphatically while Ross stood his ground, his posture rigid. Finally, Harold turned and went back into the bank, leaving Ross standing alone in the street. After a moment, the cowboy returned to where Willow waited. You should head back to the hotel, Miss Blackburn, he said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. What just happened? She asked. Who were those men? Ross sighed, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. The Dalton gang. Small-time outlaws, but dangerous enough. They've been causing trouble in the territory for a couple of years now. And they were going to rob the bank, probably. Mr. Whitfield doesn't seem to think so, but I know trouble when I see it. He glanced in the direction the riders had gone. They'll be back. Thank you, Willow said impulsively, for trying to protect the town, and me. His expression softened slightly. Just doing what anyone would do, Miss Blackburn. He collected his horse's reins. I should get these supplies back to the ranch. As he mounted up, Willow found herself reluctant to see him go. Mr. Brannigan, Ross, he corrected her. Out here, formality doesn't mean much. Ross, then, she conceded, liking the way his name felt on her tongue. Will you be at the social on Saturday? Mrs. Holloway mentioned there's to be dancing. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or a wariness that suggested he wasn't used to such invitations. I don't much care for town gatherings, Miss Blackburn. Willow, she insisted, if I'm to call you Ross. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Willow, then. He settled his hat more firmly on his head. As for the social, we'll see. With that, he touched his hat brim in farewell and rode off, leaving Willow with the distinct impression that she had just done something either very brave or very foolish. That evening, Harold called on her again, this time to discuss the wedding arrangements. The incident with the Dalton gang was not mentioned, but Willow sensed an undercurrent of tension in her fiancé that hadn't been there the previous night. I've spoken with Reverend Hayes, Harold said as they sat in the hotel's small parlor. He's prepared to perform the ceremony next Saturday. I thought we might hold the reception at my home afterward. So soon? Willow couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Harold's eyebrows rose. Is there some reason to delay? Your father's letter indicated you were prepared for the marriage to take place immediately upon your arrival. No, I suppose not, she said, though the thought of becoming Mrs. Harold Whitfield in just over a week made her heart sink. It's just that I've only just arrived. I haven't even had time to meet many people in town. You'll have plenty of time for that after we're married, Harold assured her, patting her hand in that same proprietary way. Besides, there's the social on Saturday. Most of the town will be there. Yes, Mrs. Holloway mentioned that. It sounds lovely. Harold's expression clouded slightly. I should warn you, Willow, that these frontier gatherings can be rather rustic affairs, not at all like the social events you're accustomed to in Boston. I'm sure I'll manage, she replied, a hint of steel entering her voice. She had never been particularly fond of Boston society events anyway, with their rigid rules and constant judgment. Of course you will, Harold said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. I merely want to ensure that you're comfortable with the transition to life here. There was something in his tone that gave Willow pause. Harold, may I ask you something? Certainly, my dear. Why did you agree to my father's proposal? Surely there must be eligible women here in the territory who would make suitable wives for a man of your position. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He cleared his throat, looking momentarily discomfited. Your father and I had business dealings for many years. When he found himself in difficult circumstances, I was in a position to help. The arrangement was his suggestion, but I confess I found it appealing. A man in my position requires a wife of a certain breeding. Local girls lack the refinement that comes with an Eastern upbringing. I see, Willow said, though in truth his answer troubled her. It was as if he were acquiring a social asset rather than a life partner. And what of love? Does that factor into your considerations at all? Harold looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Love is a luxury, Willow, often afforded only to the young and the foolish. At our age, I'm 22, she interrupted, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Yes, of course, he amended smoothly. But you're a practical young woman, are you not? You understand the value of security of position. Love, if it comes at all, develops over time, through shared experiences and mutual respect. He leaned forward, taking her hand in his. I promise you, Willow, that you will want for nothing as my wife. Is that not a form of love in itself? She wanted to argue to tell him that no, material comfort was not love, but she held her tongue. After all, what right did she have to demand romance? Her father had made his bargain and she had agreed to honor it. Of course, she said finally, forcing a smile. You're very generous, Harold. As he escorted her upstairs to her room, Willow couldn't help but wonder what Ross Brannigan's answer to her question might have been. Somehow, she doubted he would have spoken of love as a luxury or a practical arrangement. The next few days passed in a blur of wedding preparations and introductions to Promise Creek's residents. Willow was fitted for a wedding dress by the town's seamstress, consulted with Mrs. Cooper about the reception menu, and listened as Harold outlined their life together, all the while feeling as if she were watching someone else go through the motions. She saw Ross only once during that time, from a distance as he conducted business at the general store. Their eyes met briefly across the street, and he touched his hat in acknowledgement before mounting his horse and riding out of town. Willow told herself the pang she felt at his departure was merely disappointment at losing the chance for conversation with one of the few people in town who didn't treat her like Harold Whitfield's future possession. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze, perfect weather for the town social. The event was to be held in the meadow behind the church, where tables had been set up for food and a wooden platform constructed for dancing. By late afternoon, it seemed the entire population of Promise Creek and the surrounding ranches had gathered, dressed in their Sunday best and eager for an evening of merriment. Harold escorted Willow to the social, introducing her to those she hadn't yet met and accepting congratulations on their upcoming nuptials with the air of a man who had achieved a significant victory. Willow smiled and nodded, played her part, but her eyes kept straying to the edges of the gathering, searching for a familiar tall figure. As the sun began to set and lanterns were lit around the dance floor, the local musicians, a fiddler, a guitarist, and a man with a harmonica struck up a lively tune. Couples took to the floor, and Harold led Willow into the dance with formal precision that spoke of lessons rather than natural rhythm. "You dance beautifully," he commented as they moved through the steps of a waltz. "Thank you. My father insisted on lessons from an early age." "Another example of his foresight," Harold said, smiling in a way that was probably meant to be warm but struck Willow as calculating. "He clearly prepared you well for your role in society." The music changed to something more spirited, and other couples joined them on the floor. Willow was passed from partner to partner as the dance required, each man offering polite conversation and curious glances. She was, after all, the newcomer, the banker's future bride, an object of interest and speculation. It was during one such exchange that she found herself face to face with Ross Brannigan. He had cleaned up for the occasion, his usual trail-worn clothes replaced by a crisp white shirt, dark vest, and clean trousers. His hair was combed back, and he'd clearly shaved for the occasion. The transformation was striking. "Miss Blackburn," he said, taking her hand as the dance brought them together. "Mr. Brannigan, I wasn't sure you would come." A hint of a smile crossed his face. "I wasn't planning to, but one of my hands convinced me that fresh air and company might do me good." They moved together with the music, and Willow was surprised to find that Ross was a skilled dancer, his movements fluid and natural despite his size. "You dance well for a cowboy," she observed. "My mother insisted," he replied, echoing her earlier words with a knowing look that brought heat to her cheeks. "Said no son of hers was going to stumble around like a newborn calf at social gatherings." Willow laughed, a genuine sound that surprised even herself. "She sounds like a formidable woman." She was, Ross agreed, a shadow of old grief crossing his features. Died when I was 16, but not before making sure I knew which fork to use at dinner and how to dance without stepping on a lady's toes. The dance brought them close, then apart, then close again. Each time they came together, Willow felt a little more of her carefully constructed composure slipping away. There was something about Ross Brannigan that made her feel both unsettled and utterly alive. "I heard you visited the Triple R yesterday," he said as they circled each other. "Yes, Harold thought I should see more of the surrounding area. Your land is beautiful. It's a work in progress, not as grand as some spreads, but it's mine." There was pride in his voice, the satisfaction of a man who had built something with his own hands. "Did you see the new barn?" From a distance. Harold wasn't inclined to stop. Ross's jaw tightened slightly. No, he wouldn't be. The dance brought them together again, his hand at her waist, and he spoke more quietly. "Whitfield and I have a history, Willow. It's not a pleasant one." Before she could ask what he meant, the music ended and Harold was there, reclaiming her with a firm hand on her arm. "Brannigan," he acknowledged coolly. "I'm surprised to see you here. Cattle business must be improving if you can spare time for social gatherings." "Even a working man needs a night off now and then, Whitfield," Ross replied, his tone equally cool. "Miss Blackburn, thank you for the dance." As he walked away, Willow felt a sense of loss that was entirely disproportionate to the brief encounter. "What history do you have with Mr. Brannigan?" she asked Harold as he led her toward the refreshment table. Harold's expression darkened. "It's not a suitable topic for discussion, especially not at a social event. I think I have a right to know, especially if it concerns people I might encounter regularly once we're married." For a moment, she thought he might refuse to answer, but then he sighed. "If you must know, Brannigan and I have had business disagreements. His ranch borders land that I acquired when the previous owner defaulted on a loan. Brannigan believes I was overly harsh in my handling of the matter. Were you?" Harold looked affronted. "I merely protected my investment as any prudent businessman would. If people cannot meet their obligations, they must face the consequences." He handed her a cup of punch. "In any case, it's water under the bridge now. The Triple R is hardly a concern of ours." But Willow wasn't so sure. The tension between the two men felt too personal, too raw to be merely a business disagreement. And why had Ross specifically mentioned a new barn? There was more to this story than Harold was telling her. As the evening wore on, Willow found her gaze continually drawn to Ross. He didn't dance again, instead standing at the edge of the gathering, occasionally conversing with other ranchers or the cowboys who worked for him. Once, their eyes met across the meadow, and the intensity of his gaze sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. It was nearly midnight when Harold finally announced it was time to leave. The social was still in full swing, but he cited an early meeting the next day as reason for their departure. As they walked back toward town, Willow couldn't help glancing back at the lights and laughter they were leaving behind. "Did you enjoy yourself?" Harold asked, his arm linked formally with hers. "Yes, very much. It was nice to meet more of the townspeople." "Good. It's important that they accept you. As my wife, you'll be expected to take a leading role in community affairs." Another reminder of the life that awaited her, a life of expected duties and social obligations, not unlike what she had left behind in Boston, just on a smaller scale. A life with a man who spoke of their marriage in terms of social position and community standing, never of companionship or affection. They had reached the hotel. Harold escorted her to the door, where he bowed formally and kissed her hand. "Good night, Willow. I'll call on you tomorrow afternoon. There are some wedding details we should finalize." "Good night, Harold." She watched him walk away, a solitary figure in the moonlight before turning to enter the hotel. Martha Holloway was still up, sitting in the small parlor with her knitting. "Did you enjoy the social, dear?" she asked as Willow entered. "Yes, it was lovely." Willow hesitated, then sat down across from the older woman. "Mrs. Holloway, may I ask you something?" "Of course, child. What happened between Mr. Whitfield and Mr. Brannigan?" "I know there's some sort of disagreement between them, but Harold wasn't very forthcoming about the details." Martha's hand stilled on her knitting. "That's not really my story to tell, Miss Blackburn. Please," Willow pressed. "I'm to be married to Harold in a week. Surely I have a right to know about significant conflicts he's involved in," the older woman sighed, setting her knitting aside. "I suppose you do at that." She glanced toward the door as if to ensure they were alone, then leaned forward. "It happened about 5 years ago, right around the time Ross lost his wife and baby daughter to the fever. The Millers, that's the family that owned the land next to the Triple R, they fell behind on their loan payments to the bank. Old Mr. Miller had been injured in a fall, couldn't work like he used to. And Harold foreclosed on them," Willow guessed. "He did, but that's not the whole of it. Ross offered to buy the Miller place himself, take on their debt, keep them on as hands so they'd have a home, but Harold refused. Said he had another buyer willing to pay more." "Who was the buyer?" "That's just it, there wasn't one. At least, not right away. Harold let the place sit empty for months while he waited for land prices to rise. By the time he sold it to the Cordells, who own it now, the house had been vandalized, the fences were down, and most of the stock had been stolen or scattered." Martha shook her head sadly. "The Millers ended up moving to California to live with their daughter. Old Mr. Miller died on the journey. His wife passed a year later." "That's terrible," Willow whispered, a cold knot forming in her stomach. "And Ross blamed Harold for what happened to them." "Ross and the Millers were close. He tried to help them any way he could, but Harold had the law on his side." Martha picked up her knitting again, her needles clicking in the quiet room. "Since then, there's been bad blood between them. Ross thinks Harold's heartless, and Harold thinks Ross is a sentimental fool who doesn't understand business." Willow sat in silence, absorbing this information. It cast Harold in a very different light than the respectable businessman he presented himself as, and it explained the tension she had sensed between the two men. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Holloway. Just remember, child, there are two sides to every story." The older woman's gaze was kind but direct. "Harold Whitfield may be hard in his business dealings, but he's built this town up from nothing. Without him, many of us wouldn't be here at all." Willow nodded, though the knot in her stomach didn't loosen. "Good night, Mrs. Holloway." "Good night, dear. Sleep well." But sleep eluded Willow that night. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of Harold, of Ross, of the life that awaited her as Mrs. Whitfield. For the first time since agreeing to honor her father's arrangement, she found herself questioning whether she could go through with it. Dawn was breaking when she finally drifted into a restless slumber, only to be awakened a few hours later by shouting in the street below her window. Stumbling from bed, she peered outside to see a crowd gathering in front of the bank. At its center stood Harold, his face flushed with anger, gesturing emphatically at something Willow couldn't see. She dressed hurriedly and made her way downstairs and out into the street. As she approached the bank, the crowd parted slightly, and she saw what had caused the commotion. The bank's front window had been shattered, and across the brick facade, someone had painted crude letters spelling out "thief" in red paint that dripped like blood in the morning sun. Harold was in the midst of berating the town marshal, a middle-aged man named Davies who looked decidedly uncomfortable. "I want them found, you understand. This is vandalism, plain and simple, and I want whoever is responsible brought to justice." "We'll do what we can, Mr. Whitfield," Marshal Davies replied, his tone suggesting he wasn't particularly optimistic about the chances of success. "But it could have been anyone. Lots of folks passing through town these days." "This wasn't some random act," Harold insisted, his gaze sweeping the gathered crowd accusingly. "This was deliberate, targeted, and I have my suspicions about who might be behind it." As if on cue, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention. Ross Brannigan rode into town, reining in his horse when he saw the gathering. His expression changed from curiosity to grim understanding as he took in the damaged bank. Harold's face hardened at the sight of Ross. "Well, well. Right on time, Brannigan. Come to admire your handiwork." Ross dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. "I don't know what you're talking about, Whitfield." "No." Harold's voice dripped with sarcasm. "You expect me to believe it's a coincidence that my bank is vandalized with the word thief the day after I see you at the social for the first time in years?" "Believe what you want," Ross replied, his voice level but with an undercurrent of anger. "I was at my ranch all night." "Ask any of my hands. Your men would lie for you in a heartbeat," Harold scoffed. "Everyone knows you treat them like family instead of employees." "And what would that make me? A decent human being?" Ross's gaze hardened. "Unlike some I could name." The tension between the two men was palpable, a living thing that seemed to vibrate in the air. Willow found herself moving forward, drawn by an impulse she couldn't name. "Harold," she said, placing a hand on his arm, "perhaps this isn't the best venue for accusations." He looked down at her as if noticing her presence for the first time. "Willow, you shouldn't be here. This is no concern of yours." "I disagree," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor of anger she felt at his dismissal. "If I'm to be your wife, then surely anything that concerns you concerns me as well." Harold looked momentarily taken aback while a flash of something surprise, respect, crossed Ross's face. The onlookers murmured among themselves, clearly not used to seeing Harold Whitfield contradicted, especially by a woman. "Very well," Harold said finally, his tone clipped, "but I still insist that Marshal Davies investigate this incident thoroughly. I want whoever is responsible punished to the full extent of the law." "We'll do our job, Mr. Whitfield," Davies assured him, looking relieved at the slight diffusion of tension. "Now, if you'll all disperse and go about your business, we can start cleaning up this mess." The crowd began to break up, though many cast curious glances at Willow, Harold, and Ross, who remained in a tense triangle at the center of the street. "I didn't do this," Ross said quietly, addressing himself to Willow rather than Harold. "Whatever disagreements I have with Mr. Whitfield, I wouldn't resort to vandalism to express them." "Of course you would deny it," Harold snapped. "What else would you do?" "I'd speak my piece to your face, Whitfield, not hide behind anonymity and paint." Ross's gaze was steady, unflinching. "I think you know that." For a moment, doubt flickered across Harold's features, quickly suppressed. "Stay away from my bank, Brannigan, and stay away from my fiancée." With that, he took Willow's arm and steered her toward the bank's entrance. She glanced back once to see Ross still standing in the street, watching them go with an expression she couldn't interpret, but that made her heart race nonetheless. Inside the bank, Harold's composure cracked slightly. He paced behind his desk, running a hand through his normally immaculate hair. The audacity, the sheer, brazen audacity. "You really believe Mr. Brannigan is responsible?" Willow asked, taking a seat across from him. "Who else would it be? The man has harbored a grudge against me for years." He stopped pacing, fixing her with a sharp look. "Why are you defending him?" "I'm not defending anyone," she replied evenly. I'm simply asking if you have any proof beyond your personal animosity." Harold's eyes narrowed. "You seem to have developed quite an interest in Brannigan. May I remind you that in less than a week you will be my wife?" The possessiveness in his tone sent a chill down Willow's spine. "I haven't forgotten our arrangement, Harold, but I won't be blind to the happenings in this town simply because they involve someone you dislike. Our arrangement, as you call it, involves more than just the legal bonds of matrimony," Harold said, his voice cold. "It requires loyalty, Willow. I expect my wife to stand beside me, not question me in public. And I expect my husband to treat me as a partner, not a possession," she replied, rising to her feet. "If you'll excuse me, I think I need some air." She left the bank before he could respond, her heart hammering in her chest. Never in her life had she spoken so boldly to a man, especially not one with power over her future. The shock of her own audacity left her feeling both exhilarated and terrified. Outside, the town had largely returned to its normal rhythm, though workers were already boarding up the broken bank window. Willow walked without direction, needing movement to calm her racing thoughts. She found herself heading toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open country. She had just passed the last house when she heard the sound of a horse approaching from behind. Turning, she saw Ross Brannigan riding toward her at a slow walk. He reined in beside her, looking down with concern. "Are you all right, Miss Blackburn? You shouldn't be out here alone." "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed her. "I just needed to walk." He studied her face for a moment, then dismounted, leading his horse alongside her as she continued walking. "Whitfield upset you." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "We had a disagreement." "About me?" She glanced at him, surprised by his directness. "Partially. He seems convinced you're responsible for the vandalism." "And what do you think?" Willow stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "I think that if you had a grievance with Harold Whitfield, you would confront him directly, not resort to painting words on a building in the dead of night." Something like approval flickered in Ross's eyes. "You've got a good measure of me, considering we've barely spoken, Mrs. Holloway told me about the Millers," she admitted. "About what happened with their land." Ross's expression darkened. "Did she now? And did that change your opinion of your future husband?" "I don't know what to think," Willow confessed, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I came here to honor my father's arrangement to secure my future. I barely know Harold or you, for that matter. I don't know who to believe or what to trust." To her horror, tears welled in her eyes. She turned away, not wanting him to see her weakness. There was a moment of silence, then she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Willow," Ross said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Look at me." She turned reluctantly, brushing at her tears with the back of her hand. Ross stood close, his eyes full of a warmth she hadn't expected. "I can't tell you what to think or who to trust," he said. "But I can tell you that you deserve more than a marriage built on obligation. You deserve someone who really sees you and values what he sees." "You don't know me," she whispered. "I know enough," he replied. "I know you're brave enough to travel across the country to honor a promise. I know you're kind enough to care about strangers like the Millers. And I know you're strong enough to stand up to Harold Whitfield, which is more than most people in this town can say." His words touched something deep inside her, a place that had been hollow since her father's death, perhaps even before. Without thinking, she reached up and laid her hand against his cheek. His skin was warm beneath her palm, rough with the beginnings of stubble. For a long moment, they stood frozen in that pose, the air between them charged with unspoken possibility. Then, as if drawn by a force neither could resist, they moved toward each other. Ross's lips met hers in a kiss that started gently, but quickly deepened into something more urgent, more honest than anything Willow had experienced before. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Willow felt as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Nothing in her life, not her father's death, not the journey west, not even her engagement to Harold, had changed her world as completely as that single kiss. "I shouldn't have done that," Ross said, though he made no move to step away from her. "No," she agreed, her hand still resting on his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palm. "We shouldn't have. Your promise to another man." "Yes." The word felt like ashes in her mouth. Ross took her hands in his touch gentle yet firm. "Willow, I won't ask you to break your promise. That decision has to be yours alone. But I want you to know that if you chose a different path, you wouldn't be choosing it alone." The implication of his words hung in the air between them. He was offering her an alternative, a way out of her arrangement with Harold. But at what cost? Her reputation, her security. The last promise she had made to her dying father. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course." He stepped back, releasing her hands. "But time is the one thing we don't have much of. The wedding is in 5 days." "I know." She looked up at him, memorizing the lines of his face, the storm gray of his eyes. "What would you have me do, Ross? Break my word? Dishonor my father's memory? Throw away everything I've been raised to believe in for? For what? A kiss by the roadside with a man I barely know?" His expression didn't change, but she saw something shudder in his eyes. "When you put it that way, it does sound rather foolish." He gathered his horse's reins. "I should get back to the ranch." "Ross, it's all right, Willow, I understand. More than you might think." He mounted his horse with fluid grace. "I wish you happiness in your marriage, truly I do." With that, he tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Willow standing alone at the edge of town, her lips still burning from his kiss. The next 4 days passed in a blur of wedding preparations and inner turmoil. Willow went through the motions, the final fitting for her wedding dress, discussions with Reverend Hayes about the ceremony, planning the reception with Mrs. Cooper, all while her mind and heart waged a silent war. Harold was polite but distant, still smarting from their disagreement. He made no mention of Ross Brannigan, though the vandalism at the bank remained unsolved. The town seemed to have accepted that it was the work of passing troublemakers, perhaps even the Dalton gang, who had been spotted in the area again. On the night before her wedding, Willow stood at her hotel room window, gazing out at the stars that hung like diamond chips in the velvet sky. In less than 24 hours, she would be Mrs. Harold Whitfield. She would live in the grand house at the end of town, preside over social gatherings, and fulfill all the duties expected of a banker's wife. It was the life her father had wanted for her, secure, respectable, free from the financial worries that had plagued his final years. It was the life she had journeyed west to claim, so why did it feel like a prison sentence? A soft knock on her door roused her from her thoughts. Opening it, she found Martha Holloway standing in the hallway, a small package in her hands. "May I come in, dear?" the older woman asked. "Of course." Willow stepped aside, allowing Martha to enter. "I brought you something," Martha said, holding out the package. "A wedding gift of sorts." Willow unwrapped the paper to find a small, leather-bound book. Opening it, she saw that it was a journal, its pages blank and waiting. "It's lovely, thank you. I thought you might need somewhere to put your thoughts." Martha sat on the edge of the bed, her kind eyes studying Willow's face. "You seem troubled, child." For a moment, Willow considered denying it, maintaining the facade of the contented bride-to-be. But something in Martha's expression, understanding, free from judgment, broke through her reserve. "I don't know if I can go through with it," she confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush. The wedding, the marriage, all of it. Because of Ross Brannigan, Martha asked gently. Willow's head snapped up in surprise. How did you? I've seen the way you look at him, dear, and the way he looks at you. Martha smiled sadly. It's not hard to recognize, especially for someone who once knew that kind of feeling herself. It doesn't matter, Willow said, sinking into a chair by the window. I made a promise. My father arranged this marriage before he died. It was his final wish. Did he? Martha asked, her tone thoughtful. Arrange the marriage, I mean. Or did he simply accept Mr. Whitfield's offer as the only solution to a difficult situation? Willow frowned, thinking back to her father's final days, the hushed conversations with lawyers. The letter Harold had shown her after the funeral, a letter that had been brief, businesslike, with none of the fatherly affection or guidance she might have expected. I don't know, she admitted. I assumed. Parents want happiness for their children above all else, Martha said, reaching over to take Willow's hand. Even when they make mistakes, especially when they make mistakes, what they want most is for their children to have a chance at joy. She squeezed Willow's fingers gently. Do you think your father would want you to honor a promise if it meant sacrificing your happiness for the rest of your life? But what about my obligation to Harold? Willow protested, though her resolve was weakening. He's made all these arrangements, invited the whole town. Harold Whitfield has survived worse disappointments than a canceled wedding, Martha said dryly. The man owns half the town and has more money than he knows what to do with. He'll recover. And what would I do? Where would I go? The practical considerations that had driven her decision from the beginning reasserted themselves. I have no money, no family, no prospects. You have more options than you think, Martha replied. Promise Creek is a growing town. We need teachers, seamstresses, shopkeepers. And you're not without friends here. She stood, moving toward the door. Whatever you decide, Willow, make sure it's a choice you can live with for the rest of your days. After Martha left, Willow sat motionless by the window, her mind racing. Could she really consider breaking her engagement? What would become of her if she did? The practical part of her, the part that had been raised to value security and social standing above all else, recoiled at the thought. But another part of her, a part that had awakened during her time in Promise Creek, whispered that there were worse fates than uncertainty. Like the certainty of a loveless marriage to a man who saw her as an asset rather than a partner. She thought of Ross, his quiet strength, his integrity, the way he had looked at her as if she were something precious, something worth fighting for. She thought of the kiss they had shared, the promise in his words. You wouldn't be choosing it alone. With sudden clarity, Willow knew what she had to do. It would cause scandal, would perhaps even make her an outcast in the eyes of some. But for the first time since her father's death, she felt the stirring of something like hope. Morning dawned clear and bright, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to mock the turmoil within Willow's heart. She dressed simply in a blue traveling dress, her hair arranged neatly beneath a small hat. Her wedding gown hung untouched in the wardrobe, a silent reproach. Harold had arranged for a carriage to collect her at 10 o'clock to take her to the church. The ceremony was scheduled for 11, with the reception to follow at his home. The entire town would be there to witness the union of Promise Creek's wealthiest citizen and his Eastern bride. At 9:30, Willow sat down at the small desk in her room and began to write. The letter was brief but clear, explaining her decision without placing blame. She sealed it and left it propped against the mirror where it would be easily found. Then, taking only a small valise with her most essential belongings, she slipped down the back stairs of the hotel and out into the morning sunshine. The town was quiet, most residents already at the church or making final preparations for the celebration to follow. Willow walked swiftly toward the livery stable at the edge of town. She had arranged for a horse the previous evening, claiming she wanted to take an early morning ride to calm her pre-wedding nerves. The stableman had the animal saddled and waiting, a sturdy bay mare with gentle eyes. "Sure you don't want a buggy instead, Miss Blackburn?" he asked as she mounted. "Might be more comfortable for a lady." "The horse will be fine, thank you," she replied, settling her skirts as best she could. "I won't be gone long." It wasn't exactly a lie. She wouldn't be gone long from the stable, just from Promise Creek itself. Whether she would ever return depended on what she found at her destination. As she rode out of town, heading north toward the Triple R, Willow felt a curious mixture of terror and exhilaration. She was breaking every rule of propriety she had ever been taught, risking her reputation and her future on the strength of feelings that had blossomed in less than 2 weeks. It was madness by any rational standard. Yet it also felt more right than anything she had done since agreeing to her father's arrangement. The ride to the Triple R took nearly an hour, the trail winding through rolling grassland dotted with wildflowers. In the distance, Willow could see the mountains that formed the western boundary of the territory, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. As she approached the ranch, she could make out the main house, a sturdy 2-story structure built of logs and stone, several outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and beyond them, the new barn Ross had mentioned. It wasn't as grand as Harold's home in town, but there was something about it that spoke of permanence, of a place built to endure. Several cowboys looked up from their work as she rode into the yard, their expressions curious. One of them, an older man with a weathered face, approached as she reined in her horse. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, his tone respectful but wary. "I'm looking for Mr. Brannigan," Willow said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Is he here?" The man's eyebrows rose slightly. "Boss is in the barn, checking on a new foal." He hesitated, then added, "Aren't you supposed to be getting married today, Miss Blackburn?" So her identity was known here. Willow shouldn't have been surprised. News traveled fast in small communities. "Yes," she said simply. "That's why I need to speak with Mr. Brannigan." The cowboy nodded slowly, as if coming to some private understanding. "I'll take you to him, miss." He led her to the new barn, a spacious structure with the smell of fresh-cut wood still hanging in the air. Inside, it was cool and dim after the brightness of the morning sun. At the far end, Ross knelt beside a stall where a mare and her newborn foal rested on a bed of clean straw. "Boss," the cowboy called, "you've got a visitor." Ross looked up, his expression changing from concentration to disbelief as he saw Willow standing in the barn doorway. He rose slowly to his feet. "Willow, what are you doing here?" The cowboy tactfully retreated, closing the barn door behind him and leaving them alone except for the mare and foal. Willow stepped forward, suddenly uncertain now that the moment was upon her. "I couldn't do it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't marry him." Ross moved toward her, his eyes never leaving her face. "Why not?" "Because I didn't love him. Because he didn't love me. Because it would have been a lie, and I've had enough of living according to other people's expectations." She took a deep breath. "And because of you. Me." There was wonder in his voice, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "You made me question everything: my decision to marry Harold, my reasons for coming west, what I truly wanted from my life." She took another step toward him. "You made me feel alive, Ross, and once I knew what that felt like, I couldn't go back to merely existing." He was close now, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his storm-gray eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "What about your promise?" he asked softly. "You said you were promised to another." Willow reached up, touching his face as she had on the road that day. Then I'll be the promise I keep, she whispered, to myself, to choose my own path, to follow my heart even when it's frightening. She smiled through the tears that had begun to fall. And my heart led me here to you. For a heartbeat, Ross remained still, searching her face as if looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Then, with a sound that was half laugh, half sob, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that left no room for uncertainty. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "You know this won't be easy," he said. "Whitfield is a powerful man in these parts. He won't take kindly to being left at the altar, especially not for me." "I know," she replied. "But I'd rather face whatever comes with you than spend a lifetime pretending with him." Ross smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his face. "Then we'll face it together." He took her hands in his. "Stay with me, Willow, not just today, but for all the days to come. Let me show you what love can be when it's freely given, not bargained for." "Yes," she said simply, her heart so full she could barely speak. "Yes to all of it." He kissed her again, and in that moment, with the sun streaming through the barn windows and the gentle sounds of the horses around them, Willow knew she had made the right choice. The road ahead might not be easy, but it was hers to travel, theirs to travel together. Later that morning, as they sat on the porch of Ross's house, watching the activity of the ranch unfold before them, a rider appeared on the horizon, heading toward the Triple R at a gallop. It was Martha Holloway, her normally neat appearance disheveled from the hard ride. "There you are," she exclaimed as she dismounted, relief evident in her voice. "Thank goodness I found you before they did." "Before who did?" Ross asked, rising to his feet. "Harold's formed a search party," Martha explained, accepting the glass of water Willow offered her. "He's convinced Ross has kidnapped you, Willow. They're combing the territory and they are armed." "That's ridiculous," Willow protested. "I left a letter explaining my decision." "Which Harold believes you were forced to write at gunpoint," Martha said grimly. "He's worked himself into quite a state, convinced this is Ross's revenge for the Miller affair and the bank vandalism." "The bank vandalism that I had nothing to do with," Ross pointed out. "No," Martha agreed, "but the Dalton gang did. They were captured this morning trying to rob the bank in Coopersville. Apparently, the graffiti was meant to distract attention while they prepared for the real theft." She set down her glass. "But that's not important now. What matters is that Harold is on his way here with half a dozen men, all convinced they're rescuing a kidnapped bride." Ross's expression darkened. "Let them come. I've done nothing wrong." "Neither of you has," Martha said, "but Harold is not thinking rationally. There could be violence if he arrives and finds you two together." Willow exchanged a glance with Ross, seeing the determination in his eyes. "We're not running," she said firmly. "This is my choice, and I'll tell that to Harold and anyone else who asks." "Then we'd better prepare," Ross said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. "Martha, would you mind taking Willow inside while I speak to my men? I don't want anyone getting hurt today, but I won't have armed men riding onto my property making accusations either." As Martha led her into the house, Willow watched Ross stride toward the bunkhouse where his cowboys were gathering, alerted by the commotion. There was purpose in his step, leadership in his bearing. This was a man who would stand his ground, who would protect what was his not out of possessiveness, but out of principle. Inside the ranch house, Willow was struck by its simple elegance. The furniture was sturdy and well made, the floors polished wood, the walls adorned with a few carefully chosen paintings. It was a home, not a showpiece like Harold's mansion in town. "He built most of it himself," Martha said, following Willow's gaze. "After Sarah and the baby died, he threw himself into expanding the ranch, adding onto the house. Said he needed to keep his hands busy to quiet his mind. I didn't know, Willow murmured. She had heard about Ross's loss but hadn't fully comprehended the depth of it. Will he ever truly heal from that? Time softens the sharpest grief, Martha replied. But I think meeting you has done more for him than all the years between. I've not seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you since Sarah was alive. Before Willow could respond, the sound of approaching riders reached them. Moving to the window, she saw a cloud of dust on the horizon that quickly resolved into a group of horsemen, 7 in all, with Harold Whitfield in the lead. Ross and his men, 5 cowboys armed but with their weapons holstered, stood in the yard, waiting. The tension in the air was palpable as Harold's party reined in their horses a short distance away. I can't stay in here, Willow said, moving toward the door. This is my doing and I won't hide from it. Martha caught her arm. Be careful, child. Men with wounded pride can be dangerous. So can women who have found their strength, Willow replied, gently removing Martha's hand. Don't worry, I know what I'm doing. She stepped out onto the porch just as Harold dismounted, his face flushed with anger and exertion. He looked nothing like the composed banker she had known, his clothes disheveled, his hair wild in the wind. There she is, he exclaimed, pointing at her. I knew you'd have her here, Brannigan. This is kidnapping, plain and simple. No one has kidnapped me, Harold, Willow said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. I came here of my own free will. Harold's expression faltered momentarily before hardening again. He's obviously forced you to say that. Don't worry, Willow, we're here to take you home. I am home, she replied, descending the porch steps to stand beside Ross. Or at least, I hope to make my home here with Ross. A murmur ran through the men who had accompanied Harold. They exchanged uncertain glances, clearly not having expected this turn of events. Only Harold seemed unchanged, his anger finding a new focus. So this is your revenge, Brannigan, he spat. Stealing my bride on our wedding day. I always knew you were low, but this. I didn't steal anything, Ross interrupted, his tone level but firm. Willow made her choice, a choice she should have been free to make from the beginning without being bound by an arrangement she never agreed to. An arrangement that saved her from destitution, Harold countered. Or did she fail to mention that part? How her father died leaving nothing but debts, how I generously offered marriage to spare her from poverty. I'm well aware of the circumstances, Ross said. I'm also aware that there are other ways to make one's way in the world besides selling oneself into a loveless marriage. He turned to the men who had accompanied Harold. This is a private matter between Miss Blackburn, Mr. Whitfield, and myself. There's no cause for violence, no laws broken. I suggest you all return to town. Several of the men nodded, clearly relieved at the prospect of avoiding confrontation. They began to back their horses away, but Harold's voice stopped them. So you'll all just leave. Let him get away with this. His voice had taken on a desperate edge. After everything I've done for this town, for all of you, Harold, Willow said, stepping forward. This isn't about you, not really. It's about me making a choice for my future, a choice based on feelings rather than obligation. She softened her tone. You deserve someone who loves you for yourself, not someone who marries you out of duty. We both do. For a long moment, Harold stood frozen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Then, with a visible effort, he seemed to gather the remnants of his dignity around him like a cloak. You've made your choice clear, Miss Blackburn, he said, his voice cold. I won't waste any more time trying to change your mind. He turned to Ross. As for you, Brannigan, this isn't over. Promise Creek isn't big enough for both of us, not anymore. Is that a threat, Whitfield? Ross asked quietly. Call it a promise, Harold replied. One I intend to keep. With that, he mounted his horse and rode away without a backward glance, leaving his confused posse to follow or not as they chose. Most of them did, after offering awkward nods to Ross and curious glances at Willow. Only Marshal Davies remained behind, his expression troubled. "You know he won't let this go, Ross," he said. "He's got too much pride, and you've humiliated him in front of the whole town." "I know," Ross acknowledged, "but that's tomorrow's problem. Today I'm just grateful no blood was shed." He placed his arm around Willow's shoulders. "And that Willow is safe." The marshal nodded, touching his hat brim. "Miss Blackburn, I'm glad to see you're well. There was genuine concern for your safety in town." "Thank you, Marshal," Willow replied. "I'm sorry for any worry I caused." "It wasn't my intention." "No harm done," Davies said, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "I'll let folks know you're here of your own accord. Might calm things down a bit." With a final nod, he turned his horse and rode after the others, leaving Ross, Willow, and the Triple R hands standing in the yard. "Well," Ross said after a moment, looking down at Willow with a mixture of concern and amusement, "that was quite a way to begin the day." "Not quite how I imagined it," she admitted. "I'm sorry for bringing trouble to your doorstep." "Don't be," he replied, drawing her closer. "You're worth whatever trouble comes with you." He glanced at his men, who were watching with undisguised interest. "All right, boys, show's over. Back to work. Those cattle won't herd themselves." As the cowboys dispersed, Martha approached from the house, relief evident on her face. "Thank goodness that's over. I was afraid we'd have a shootout on our hands." "Harold may be many things, but he's not foolish enough to start a gunfight he can't win," Ross said. "Though I don't doubt he meant what he said about making trouble for us." "What will you do?" Willow asked, suddenly worried about the future she had chosen. Ross smiled down at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Live our lives, build our home, face whatever comes together." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I meant what I said earlier, Willow. Stay with me, be my wife. Let me show you what love can be." In that moment, with the sun high in the sky and the vast promise of the western landscape stretching around them, Willow made another choice, one that felt as right and true as the first. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." The months that followed were not easy. As Ross had predicted, Harold Whitfield did his best to make life difficult for them. He called in loans from businesses that dealt with the Triple R, spread rumors in town, and even tried to block Ross's access to the water rights he needed for his cattle. But Promise Creek was changing, just as Willow herself had changed. New settlers arrived, people with no connection to Harold Whitfield and no interest in old feuds. The railroad that Harold had long promised finally came through, bringing with it new opportunities and a diminishment of his influence. Willow and Ross were married that autumn, in a simple ceremony performed by Reverend Hayes in the meadow behind the Triple Articus main house. Martha Holloway stood as Willow's witness, while Ross's foreman, the weathered cowboy who had first greeted Willow on that fateful morning, stood for him. The town was divided in its response. Some, particularly those with close ties to Harold, shunned the couple. Others, perhaps seeing in their story a reflection of the frontier spirit that had brought them all west, embraced them. The new schoolteacher, a young woman named Clara Jenkins, became a particular friend to Willow, as did the wife of the new doctor who set up practice in town. Gradually, as the seasons turned and life moved on, even Harold's bitterness seemed to fade. The arrival of a young widow from Denver, who invested in his bank and eventually became his wife, may have helped ease his wounded pride. While he and Ross would never be friends, the open hostility between them cooled to a distant civility. The Triple R prospered under Ross's careful management and Willow's practical influence. They added onto the house, planted a garden that was the envy of the territory, and established a breeding program for horses that quickly gained renown. And on a bright spring morning, almost exactly 2 years after Willow had ridden to the Triple R rather than walk down the aisle with Harold Whitfield, she gave birth to a daughter. They named her Elizabeth, after Willow's mother, but called her Libby. She had her father's storm-gray eyes and her mother's determination. As Ross held his daughter for the first time, the last shadows of his old grief seemed to lift. There would always be a place in his heart for Sarah and the child they had lost, but now there was room for new joy, new love, new possibilities. "She's perfect," he whispered, placing a gentle kiss on Libby's forehead before leaning down to kiss Willow as well. "Just like her mother." "Not perfect," Willow corrected him with a tired smile, "but ours, our family, our future." "The best promise I ever kept," Ross agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Loving you." As the spring sunshine streamed through the windows of the room they had prepared for their child, Willow looked at her husband and daughter and felt a sense of completion she had never thought possible. This was what it meant to follow one's heart, to choose love over obligation, courage over fear. This was what it meant to keep the promises that truly mattered. 10 years later, the Triple R had grown into one of the most successful ranches in the territory. Libby, now a spirited 10-year-old with her father's love of horses and her mother's quick mind, had been joined by 2 brothers, James, aged 8, and Thomas, a toddler of 3 who was currently doing his best to climb onto his father's lap as Ross sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Up, Papa, up," Thomas demanded, his chubby hands reaching. Ross laughed, lifting the boy easily. "You're getting too big for this, Cowboy," he teased, though both knew it wasn't true. Ross would never tire of holding his children. Willow emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been baking all afternoon, preparing for the harvest celebration that would bring neighbors from miles around to the Triple R the next day. "Is James back from town yet?" she asked, coming to sit beside Ross on the porch swing. "Just riding in now," Ross replied, nodding toward the road where their middle child could be seen approaching on his pony, a package tied securely behind the saddle. "Looks like he got the sugar you needed." "And probably talked poor Mr. Johnson's ear off at the store," Willow said with a fond smile. James had inherited her gift for conversation, along with her love of books. As she watched her son dismount and lead his pony toward the barn, Willow was struck by how much had changed in the decades since she had first arrived in Promise Creek. The town had grown, with new businesses and homes springing up along streets that were now properly graded and maintained. The railroad had brought prosperity and an influx of new settlers, changing the character of the once tiny frontier settlement. Harold and his wife had moved to Denver 5 years earlier, leaving the bank in the hands of his nephew. There had been a certain symmetry to their departure, a closing of a chapter that had allowed Willow to finally feel fully at home in the community. She and Ross had weathered their share of challenges: drought, harsh winters, the economic panic of '93 that had nearly cost them the ranch, but they had faced each crisis together, their bond only strengthening with each obstacle overcome. "Penny for your thoughts," Ross said, noticing her contemplative expression. "I was just thinking about how fortunate we are," she replied, leaning against his shoulder. "To have all this, to have each other." "Fortunate indeed," he agreed, shifting Thomas to his other knee so he could put his arm around her. "Though I'd say it's more than fortune. It's the result of choices we made, promises we kept to each other." Willow smiled, remembering that long-ago day when she had ridden to the Triple R, her heart pounding with fear and hope. "The best choice I ever made," she said softly, "coming to you that day." "The best day of my life," Ross replied, his voice rough with emotion. when you said you'd be the promise you keep. As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Willow looked at her husband and son, at the home they had built together, and felt a deep contentment that transcended mere happiness. This was where she belonged, where she had always been meant to be, though she hadn't known it when she first stepped off the stagecoach in Promise Creek all those years ago. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important promises were not the ones made to others, but the ones we make to ourselves to be true to our hearts, to seek joy rather than mere security, to embrace love in all its messy, complicated, wonderful forms. Those were the promises worth keeping, the ones that transformed not just a moment or a day, but an entire life.